Hello YouTube, I'm here with Cole Nasrallah doing another one of these text analysis videos, and well, I think that's all I actually need to say by way of introduction. I'm now going to hand it over to Cole. Is there anything you need to say to the class? Your class?
Hi to my 101 class. Today we're going over Hume's identity theory. Briefly, we're going to be calling it bundle theory, as long as Kane's okay with that. It'll be less line by line than some of the other texts we've analyzed, but take notes. You will likely be given a short essay question from this lecture, and hopefully you enjoy it. So yeah, let's rock and roll.
All right, so there we are. We're now looking at the text. So I don't
know if there's anything you want to say about David Hume, actually.
I think that we might need to give a bit of background as we go through. I don't know if there's anything we need to say.
Yeah, actually, I've got a little something.
Okay.
So, we've got this introduction. There are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call ourself, that we feel its existence and continuance in existence, and are certain beyond the evidence of a demonstration both of its perfect identity and simplicity. I wanted to identify some vocab words in there for people who are unfamiliar with the moderns and conversations that were going on, and just broadly philosophical jargon. So when Hume says simplicity, he means fewest parts, parsimony, or something like that, something non-divisible, maybe. And generally that's going to be something like a soul in this case. So when we say simplicity, we don't mean necessarily like easy to understand or basic or something like that. We just mean it's non-divisible. Is that how you define it, Kane?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, fantastic. He's also, just a quick note for anybody not familiar with Hume, and if I say this in a way that upsets you, Kane, please let me know. But he's going to talk some smack on metaphysicians. And this is because of the modern debate, which we covered a little bit in my class, right? There are two ways of knowing about things. You can know about the world through pure reason, or you can know about the world through experience or empirical observation. And Hume is definitely an empiricist. So when he talks to the metaphysicians and is trash talking them, it's because he's going to argue that they're just making stuff up. And a lot of that happens in this introduction. So that's what's going on for at least this beginning bit. And I think that's some good background information about Hume in general.
Yeah. That was actually the background information I had in mind when I said we might need to say something as we were going through the piece. Hume's empiricism, because that plays a really important role in his argument. So yeah.
Yeah, he wants to see it. He as an empiricist, he is going to say, where did you get this idea of a self from?
Right.
Sound good?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
And so
I particularly go ahead.
No, I was just say, I guess that sort of brings us on to this second paragraph, unless there was something more you needed to say.
I love his writing, and I encourage my students to read it. But where does he get? He gets very sassy somewhere in here, and I wanted to make sure we didn't miss that. Is it in the second paragraph? Ah, yes. Right. Unluckily, all these positive assertions, and when he says positive assertions, he means assertions of the existence of a self. So positive doesn't mean like happy or good. It means the existence of something. So positive is something exists. Negative is the absence of something. So Unlucky, all these positive assertions are contrary to that very experience which is pleaded for them, nor have we any idea of self after the manner it is here explained.
So I think one thing to bear in mind about what Hume is doing here, he's not simply denying that the self exists. He's going to deny that we have even a coherent conception of what the self could be. So, it's not like to compare it to, say, a different debate. An atheist might say that God does not exist, but that God is something that could exist in principle. But you might also say that the very idea of God is just completely confused and incoherent, and so in principle it's not the sort of thing that even could exist because we don't have a coherent conception of what it is we're talking about. That's what Hume is claiming about the self, that it's not something we even have a coherent conception of. And this itself derives from his empiricism. Hume argues that all of our ideas must be based on sensory experience, and so since we don't have any sensory experience that could ground a concept of the self, we don't really have a coherent idea of it. So I think that's just something to bear in mind.
I give my students the example of a square circle. I realize, for a more well-versed philosophic audience, you're immediately going to see that that's a logical contradiction. But also, try imagining a square circle. You can't. Or, as Locke would have us do, try imagining, not as Locke would have us do, but as Berkeley would have us do in response to Locke, try imagining something with primary properties, right? With physical extension, but without color, or without texture. You can't. Even in theory, you can't. And that's the level of criticism that Hume is laying on the concept of self. He's like, you think you can do it, but the second you actually try to define a self, you'll find it's an impossibility. It's nonsense.
Yeah. So Hume's argument then is going to be that in order for us to have a coherent conception of the self, we would have to be able to sort of show how it corresponds to some sensory impressions, but there just is nothing there that there are no impressions that can kind of ground that idea.
And because I love how sassy Hume is, I do want to highlight the next sentence. This question, 'tis impossible to answer without a manifest contradiction and absurdity. And yet 'tis a question which must be necessarily answered, if we would have the idea of self pass for clear and intelligible, which is, Hume's fancy way of saying what Kane and I just kind of unpacked there. If you're going to say that a self exists, you're going to have to give us necessary and sufficient conditions for a self, or some kind of clear definition of self. So he's throwing down the gauntlet here.
So, I guess the next question would be, well, why does Hume think that we can't identify any impressions that correspond to the self? So I think that his point here is just that the self is supposed to be something that persists through our lives. So, to tie this back to the discussion we were having previously about personal identity, remember the idea of personal identity is it's supposed to be something that makes me now the same person that I was yesterday, the day before that, 5 years ago, and so on. So Hume thinks that the self is supposed to be something that persists unchanging through all of the mental changes that we go through, but that if we
or at least
look inside ourselves,
for it to be a meaningful.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I don't want to confuse my students, because that's exactly what Hume's arguing against. So he's saying other people assert that such a self exists, such a self that would make me the same person when I was a baby as who I am when I die, to have the same identity. Oh, you just said Hume wants, and I just wanted to make sure I clarified that that's what Hume is demanding of people who say such a self exists.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was just a point of clarification.
Yeah. That was probably sloppy language on my part then.
I think we just deal with different audiences. It's okay.
Can't remember where I was actually. Had I finished
I
point?
interrupted you. You're talking about looking for these impressions, some impression of the self.
Yeah, so it's where Hume says here, but self or person is not any one impression, but that to which are several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. So the self is argued to be something that persists throughout people's lives. But as Hume says, there is no impression constant and invariable. So if you look inside your own mind, you will find just all this like changing jumble of impressions and emotions and feelings and so on, and there just is nothing that exists unchanging throughout your whole life. Hume concludes, it cannot therefore be from any of these impressions or any other that the idea of self is derived, and consequently there is no such idea. So that's just I think that's basically his argument, right?
Yeah. Consequently, there is no such idea. When he says idea, he means something more than just like a thing you're thinking of. Just to be clear for my students or people who are just coming to philosophy, he's saying it's not clear, it's not coherent. You change, everything changes. This next paragraph, it kind of,
before we,
I think it's more of the same.
Before we move on to the next paragraph, I don't know if it would be kind of helpful to just like formalize Hume's argument in a way.
Absolutely.
Set it out. So I've got, my version here, which I'm just going to write down, and I'll say it to you as I'm saying it. So the first premise then is going to be that all ideas are derived from sense impressions.
Perfect.
That's obviously just a statement of Hume's empiricism. And then the second is going to be something like that the self is something that persists through mental changes. So this is like a summary of what people who believe in the self are supposed to be believing in, right? That the self is supposed to be something that persists over your whole life.
Well, it has numeric identity throughout all of time. It's one and the same throughout all of time.
Yeah. But then this is the next premise, but we have no sensory impression of something persisting through mental changes. All of our mental states, all of the impressions and ideas we have are just constantly changing, and there is no impression of something that exists unchanging through our lives. And so the conclusion will be that we have no idea of the self.
And just to be clear, this is I know you've said this a million times, but when Hume is saying, well, not a million, but a couple, when Hume's saying impression, that's coming from the fact that he's an empiricist. So for him, impression means we have no empirical evidence of, we have no experience of ourself as a cohesive, unchanging whole.
Yeah.
Just vocab again to clarify the jargon.
If you want me to send you the argument I just wrote out, because
Well, I assume you recorded it.
I
so.
have, but you can tell me whether this summary is acceptable. That was just what
I heard it. I'm good to go.
Okay, well, I've sent it anyway.
All right.
So yeah,
we formalize.
I think it's it's a fairly straightforward argument, right? Like the idea is just, well, the self must be something that's persisting and stable, but all of our impressions, everything that's going on in our heads, let's say, that's transient and changing. So that's the basic idea.
Yeah, and the idea of something being the same requires that it in some meaningful way be the same, and this is something that definitionally cannot be the same.
Okay. So I don't know. Do you want to move on to the next paragraph, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we need to read the introduction to it, but in my readings of Hume, this is where he really unpacks what it is, his search for himself. And I definitely want to highlight midway into this paragraph what begins with, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and observe any but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long as I am insensible of myself and may truly be said not to exist." He's looking back on his life, on his empirical experience of the world, and he's saying, well, I can remember warmth on a beach, and the feeling of the sand, and the fact that it was immensely pleasurable. I can catch all these sensations, but what is the object? What is the person experiencing that? I can't. It's just a matter of these external objects or these impressions, right? Is there a better way you'd like to put that, or is that all right for you?
I think that is a good summary of what Hume is saying here.
I think this is pretty strong evidence in some ways.
I mean, just the other point as well here is that. So I think that it's worth kind of noting that when we think about perceptions, or at least what Hume seems to have in mind is, he seems to think that people often think of experiences as being like as belonging to something, as it's like I have, say, an experience of a color, like the shade of red, and it's almost like it's my perception, or I have an emotional feeling, and it's not like there's just an emotion that exists kind of independent of everything else. We tend to think of it as being an emotional experience that's mine. But one of the things Hume is saying here is, well, actually, like, when you examine your perceptions, you find that they're all different, they're all distinguishable, they can be considered separately from each other, and there doesn't seem to be anything that they're connected to, right? They don't seem to belong to anything.
They're just these impressions floating out in the world.
Yeah.
Or, well, yeah, not belonging to anything in particular maybe is better than floating out in the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's maybe a less controversial way of putting it, right?
And I mean, so there are some problems. We both love Hume, but there are some problems with this as evidence for the non-existence of self, right? And maybe I'm interpreting him a bit uncharitably, but it seems like saying I can't use myself to detect myself. which seems kind of strange to me. Like maybe we shouldn't expect to be able to use the very tool, the perceiving thing, to be able to perceive itself.
Yeah. So by analogy, you wouldn't expect a camera to be able to take a snapshot of itself, right? If you take a camera and start snapping the world, you're going to get pictures of the world, but you're not going to get pictures of the camera itself. I mean, oh well, I guess you could point it at a mirror or something, and then that ruins the analogy. But assuming you don't have any mirrors available, the camera's not going to take a picture.
Yeah,
of itself.
so like if you're showing somebody, your scrapbook from a vacation, and they're like, "Oh, look at all these lovely photos. How did you do this without a camera?" That would be a crazy question to ask, and that almost maybe that's an uncharitable interpretation of Hume here, but this doesn't strike me as strong evidence because of that, because maybe that tool doesn't capture itself.
Yeah, and I guess one way to really put the challenge to Hume here is his methodology asks us to, as he says, like when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, and he's kind of asking us to look inside our minds and try to find the impression that corresponds to the self. The obvious question would be, well, what is it that's doing the looking, right? When you look inside your own mind,
Yes.
What is it that's doing that? Isn't that the self? So there's a worry that the methodology that Hume is using assumes the existence of what he's trying to deny, which I guess is kind of another way of putting this same objection.
Yeah, that beautiful. Yeah, you can't even construct the sentence. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, without referring somehow to yourself.
I mean, I think that. I mean, you say that that's possibly uncharitable. I don't know if that's the case because, like, I think this is probably a big problem for Hume. But to say something in defence of Hume, it sort of still leaves this question of, well, okay, but what exactly is the self supposed to be? And I mean, my thought would be, well, let's say we strip away all of the stuff that we actually encounter when we look inside ourselves, right? So the idea is the self. So the idea of your objection seems to be that the self isn't something we're going to actually encounter when we look, because the self is what's doing the looking, right? So let's strip away all of the stuff we encounter, right? Strip away all of our sensory data. So we're no longer seeing anything, no longer hearing anything, no longer touching, no longer getting any of those impressions. Strip away all of the emotions, right? So you're no longer experiencing happiness or sadness or so on. Strip away all of the thoughts, all of the mental imagery, all of the stuff that you find when you look inside your own mind. What's left? Like just bare consciousness.
Maybe something like Descartes' thinking thing.
But then it's not going to be thinking, because like you have impressions.
It can't
of
think
your thoughts,
about anything.
right? Yeah. So it's what is it? Just a kind of bare But what would that be? Would you be willing to say that a bare a sort of piece of consciousness that has absolutely no emotions, no thoughts, no personality? Would you be happy to say that that's yourself? Seems a bit odd,
Yeah,
right?
no, it's a good challenge. Yeah, it's unsatisfying. If somebody really wants to cling to that idea that they do have a self once all of the empirical is stripped away, what they end up with something is the thing they end up with is kind of anemic and unsatisfying. It's not clear how that is in any way meaningfully you as an individual. In fact, they would all kind of look identical, right? All of our truest selves would be this very bare bones chunk, non-divisible chunk of consciousness that doesn't really do or think or perceive anything. It sucks the meaning out of identity.
Yeah, exactly. And so I suppose that's not quite the argument Hume was giving, but maybe that's another way of making his point.
We could be a bit more charitable. Yeah. Wonderful. That's exciting. Are you ready to move on? I think this paragraph has a lot in it, but I think that's about the best we can do with this for right now.
I'm happy to move on if you are, yeah.
Excellent. I didn't have any notes for quite a while. What's your next
Oh, really?
note?
Well, I do have some notes.
Oh.
Let me just
Yes, let's go
and
over
I think
that.
that it might be kind of important. But where is it? Okay, so this is where Hume kind of just summarizes what his theory is, right? So he's just denied the existence of a self.
Yes.
So he's going to need to give some sort of positive account of what's actually going on, like with personal identity and those sorts of issues. So in paragraph number 4, he says,
That's exactly where I was
we are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. And you mentioned earlier bundle theory. This is where that term comes
there
from.
It is.
Right. So just
that was exactly what I wanted to skip to, and with the brief acknowledgement that he is trash talking the metaphysicians again at the beginning of this paragraph. I do like how he ends briefly. I like how he ends the last paragraph, which is just to say, like, hey, if you think you can find yourself in that, stripped down, pared down chunk of consciousness or whatever it is you'd be, fine, but I can't do it, and I'm extremely skeptical anyone can. I feel like he's kind of rolling his eyes. And then he moves on to paragraph 4. So that's all I really wanted to say.
Oh, okay.
About that. I just like when they're sassy. I like when philosophers are sassy. So I will take a moment to acknowledge the sass.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I think there's a certain humour in that particular passage. Yeah.
All right. He starts giving the rest of this paragraph largely seems to be just, again, evidence for his bundle theory, right? Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Our thought is still more variable than our sight, and all our other senses and faculties contribute to this change, nor is there any single power of the soul which remains unalterably the same, perhaps for one moment. That's heavy, right? So you want to say there's this unchanging soul, and this is, I think, the first time he calls it what a lot of people would want to call it, which is the soul. And he's like, well, no, there's this, not for one moment is there an unchanging self. Look at how rapidly everything changes and how infinitely variable everything that you think of as yourself is.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any additional notes there?
Not for that bit, no. I think that's...
Okay, I do love the next sentence, and I want to read it for my students and make sure they read it. Okay. The mind is a kind of theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. That's you. Writ large, or in summary, that is you as Hume understands it. Okay, now I'm done.
Okay. Yeah, so that's Hume's positive conception, right? It's that there is no self, and all a person is, all each of us is just this constantly changing bundle of impressions and ideas. That's it. Nothing unifies them, as it were.
Perfect. They come, they go, they leave. It's just I referred in my earlier video to Hume's concept of the self as just a box that things sift through. And Hume's going to say it seems like we have an identity because things enter and leave the box or the theater very gradually with humans, but that's the only reason we think that we exist.
Right. Yeah.
And he makes again the assertion there is properly no simplicity, meaning no non-divisible thing, in it at one time, nor identity indifferent. Right? Whatever natural propension we may have to imagine that simplicity and identity. So that's you think you have self, but you don't. Just very briefly in summary, you think that theater contains some essence of you, but it simply doesn't. If you are anything, you are that ever-changing theater.
Yeah. And well, I guess that then raises the question of like, well, why, right? Why do we tend to think of ourselves as having this identity over time?
Which then, he asks in paragraph 5.
Yes, which I think is, as you say, nice segue to paragraph 5, and that kind of occupies him for a lot of the rest of the paper. So
crush it, Kane, get it.
So, Hume, paragraph 5. What then gives us so great a propension to ascribe an identity to these successive perceptions and to suppose ourselves possessed of an invariable and uninterrupted existence through the whole course of our lives? So that's the next question. Hume's denied the existence of a self, of something that persists unchanging through our lives. Then the next question is, well, why, right? Why do we have this tendency to suppose that there is such a thing? So, hello everybody. We just had to take a bit of a break, but now we're back. Actually, I think we took a break at kind of the right time because what we've been talking about so far, Hume has been discussing personal identity, but now he's moving on to talk about identity in general. So from paragraph 6 to paragraph 14, Hume turns to consider the question of the persistence of objects in general, and then he applies some of his conclusions to personal identity. So we'll be looking at that, right?
Yep.
Okay then. So paragraph 6. Is there anything you want to say about this?
I mean, so I do think that this is where we can really start talking about time as well, because he talks about, well, we also have a distinct idea of several different objects existing in succession and connected together by a close relation. I don't know that there's any particular quote in here that speaks to me particularly well, but, and correct me if I'm wrong, this seems to be the section where it kind of describes, like, you know, if I had a chair and a chip came off of it, would that be the same chair? That sort of thing. Is that essentially a decent summary in your understanding?
Yeah. So I think that this paragraph, paragraph 6, and the next few paragraphs just discusses like what it takes for any object to maintain the same identity over time, or for an object to persist over time. And so he starts off paragraph 6 by saying, well, look, we have a distinct idea of an object that is the same over time, and that, as he puts it, that remains invariable and uninterrupted through a supposed variation of time. So that's an object that has identity over time. And then we also have a distinct idea of several different objects existing in succession. And he calls that diversity. And his claim is going to be that there are many circumstances where we end up conflating these two things. So we end up conflating identity and diversity.
I'm sorry, yeah, I skipped ahead a paragraph, my bad. But yes, good.
And I think the key idea is that what Hume's interested in here is like, what exactly is it that leads our minds, as it were, to ascribe identity to an object over time? And so the key idea is at the, well, sort of almost midway through paragraph 6, where he says that action of the imagination by which we consider the uninterrupted and invariable object, and that by which we reflect on the succession of related objects, are almost the same to the feeling, nor is there much more effort of thought required in the latter case than the former. The relation facilitates the transition of mind from one object to another, and renders its passage as smooth as if it were contemplated one continued object. So I guess the contemplation of an object that remains the same over time, it sometimes feels the same as contemplating an object that's changing gradually over time, and that's what leads us to conflate identity with diversity in some cases.
Well, he says it in the next sentence. This resemblance is the cause of the confusion and mistake, and makes us substitute the notion of identity instead of that of related objects.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Pretty straightforward.
yeah, it's a claim that the mind has a tendency to move from one object to the next smoothly, and when it does that, it assumes that it's thinking of the same object, even if it's not really the same. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's go on, because I think he says it better than I'm going to. However, at one instant we may consider the related succession as variable or interrupted. We are sure the next to ascribe to it a perfect identity and regard it as invariable or uninterrupted. We can recognize that the thing has changed, but we're still going to want in the next moment to say, well, no, it's the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I get, and I think Hume's, well, what Hume is working with here is the assumption that in order for an object to genuinely be the same object over time, it would have to have exactly the same properties from one time to the next. So if you... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, so if you take an object and alter it ever so slightly, well, it's now different, right? Because some of its properties have changed.
The way I described it for my class is Hume is going to say, to fill in that little blank problem we created, the necessary and sufficient conditions for identity, he's going to say A at T1 is equal to B at T2 if and only if they have all the exact same properties. And we are talking down to the atom. I'm not sure if spatial temporal location would factor in for him. Can things move? Actually, that's a good question. Maybe I'll make a short answer question for that. But can things move?
Well, I think
Like
that Hume is assuming...
and remain the same?
I think Hume is assuming that an object can remain the same provided it retains all of its intrinsic properties. So, you know, all of the properties that are like internal to it, rather than its relation to other things. And the only reason why is because if he was assuming that like any property at all, any change in any property, including relational properties, would render it a different object, then we couldn't have an idea of identity over time. Because obviously, like the minute you change the time, well, now an object exists at a different time, right? So that's a different property, so it would count as a different object.
Yeah.
So I think Hume is assuming as long as all of the matter and the relations of the matter remain the same over different times, then it's the same object.
I'm trying to remember. There is a name for these two problems of identity, or there are distinct names. There's identity in general, a thing existing at all, and then a thing persisting through time. And I can't. Do you recall the name of those two different types of identity?
No, not off the top. I'm not.
Are you familiar with that idea? Because there is, as I've always taken Hume, there's, yes, you have a bundle, but that bundle in and of itself is in no way an identity, even at like a particular moment. It's not just a matter of
yeah.
failure to persist. It is a failure for there to be any kind of identity.
Okay, yeah. I think that, I mean, this is something that actually, it struck me as kind of unclear in the paper, because there are points in other pieces by Hume where it seems like he can mount another kind of argument against the self, which is just to say, well, it's not just that the bundle changes over time, it's that there is nothing at all at any one time that unifies the bundle of impressions of ideas into a single thing. And he does kind of say that, but these are two very different ideas that are not clearly distinguished. So on the one hand, we have this argument that there's nothing that persists over time in our minds, as it were. There's just this changing bundle of impressions and ideas. So if you look at the mind over time, there's no persisting thing. There's no single unchanging persisting thing. That's one point. But then there's this other point, which is that if you just look at the mind at any one particular time, what you have are a whole load of distinct impressions and ideas, and there's nothing that unifies them. And of course, I mean, Hume is then, it would, I think, say the same about any object, right? So if you take an apple or a cup, what that consists of is just a bundle of properties. The apple has, say, redness and sweetness and a certain texture and so on. Take away those properties, there is no unifying thing. It's not like there's some thing that bears those properties. There's just the bundle of properties.
Exactly. And part of the reason I wanted to bring this up now when we discussed Hume is because with my class, when we discussed Descartes, there's the whole I think, therefore I am. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Hume's response to that seems to be like, no, there's just thinking going on. There doesn't have to be anything doing the thinking. And I promised them I would explain to them how that worked out. And this seems like an apt moment to bring that up. If you don't even have a box, a container, right? A bundle, you just have all these properties, not floating around, but all these properties, and they happen to be arranged in this way at this time, and other properties will be arranged in a different way at another time. It's not just that you have the problem of survival of identity, you have the problem of identity. What holds those things cohesively together? What makes them the bundle that is you at that brief moment? It is entirely possible then to see how Hume's response to Descartes would be, well, no, I think, therefore I am doesn't work. There could just be thinking going on in the room.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's absolutely right.
Was that crazy talk? Okay. Yeah. All right, excellent. I'm so glad we got to bring that up, because I don't want to make them promises that I don't follow through on. So that's what it would mean for thinking to be going on in the room without necessarily necessitating, there's too many necessaries in a sentence, without necessitating any identity be doing the thinking. Okay, sorry. Back to the Hume. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, so back to the Hume, like you say. Okay, where are we? Paragraph 6. I don't know, anything else you want to say about this paragraph?
Not particularly. I moved through it pretty quickly in my most recent reading. It seems pretty. To highlight the sass yet again. Right, maybe 10 lines up from the bottom. We do have, thus we feign the continued existence of the perception of our senses to remove the interruption and run into the notion of a soul and self and substance to disguise the variation. I think that I like that he has just laid it out right there. The sense of the soul or a self or substance or whatever is entirely delusive.
Yeah.
Right. And if I were to ask my students a question about Hume's sentiment on this would be a lovely thing to quote, because he's very plain spoken at times. So I wanted to highlight that for them. But I don't really have anything else to pull out of this.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess to move on, where are we then? Paragraph 7. So I think actually what Hume's doing in the next few paragraphs then is, I don't know if we need to like take each one and look at each one specifically, but he's going to try to show the ways in which our minds can be led to attribute identity over time when there really isn't identity, or when our minds can be led to attribute the fiction of something that exists and persists unchanged through time. Sorry, were you going to...
And he does identify it as a fiction.
Yes.
That's the exact language he's using. So as you're reading this independently, yeah, it's an illusion we create for ourselves. But I mean, he does continue to point out that it feels like we exist, but that's going to be insufficient for him to validate that there is any identity that persists through time. So, yeah, the sentiment gives rise to the illusion.
Yeah, and I think an important point to bear in mind. Where is this? So it's, I mean, I guess he's already said this, but it's just, just to reiterate the point. For as such a succession answers evidently to our notion of diversity, it can only be by mistake we attribute it to it an identity, and as the relation of parts which leads us into this mistake is really nothing but equality, which produces an association of ideas and an easy transition of the imagination from one to another. So again, the point that Hume is making is what leads us to see objects that change as having this persistent identity over time is just the fact that we have this, what he calls easy transition of the imagination. So when I have like a cup, let's say, and the cup is constantly changing in all sorts of ways, very minor ways, but there'll be a little scratch on it one day, or maybe there'll be a mark on it another day, or whatever. It's like just it gradually changes, and the point is each change makes a new object. It's a different object with each change, but because the change is gradual, our minds kind of just easily move from the cup without the scratch to the cup with the scratch, and so we see it as being this single thing. And we create a narrative for that cup. Yeah.
He does say, I'm trying to find it, it might be in a later paragraph, he does point out that human beings tend to change properties very slowly. Like we're pretty intransigent as transigent objects go. But it must be in a later paragraph. It's not in this one.
Yeah, I think so. I think from paragraph 6 to 14, he's just talking about like objects in general, the inanimate and animate objects, and then he applies this stuff to personal identity a bit later. In
chapter, or not chapter, but section 15. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, let's move through those and get to 15, unless you had any notes that you wanted to share.
Well, just to draw attention to how his argument is structured. Paragraphs 8 and 9, where is it? 8, 9, 10, I think, just describe some of these ways that we are led to attribute identity over time. So in paragraph 8, this is where he says, take a mass of matter. If you make a tiny change to it, well, you have destroyed the identity because it's no longer the same thing. But because it's a tiny change, the mind doesn't notice it. So the passage of thought from the object before the change to the object after the change is smooth. Then in paragraph 9, he points out that proportion matters. So if I take a cup and cut it in half, well, because that's such a massive change, then I notice the difference. But small, the same change, the same kind of change, like removing the same amount of matter from a mountain, it isn't going to seem like such a big change, because, like,
in regard to a planet.
Yeah. So I think he doesn't say this explicitly, but I think there's a hint of an argument here, which might go something like this: if we change an object significantly, then we're inclined to call it a new object. If we change it gradually, we're inclined to say that the new object is identical to the original. But why would it matter whether the change is gradual or dramatic? So the point is, there isn't really an objective standard for distinguishing, like, sudden change from gradual change, or small change from great change. When we attribute identity, it really is simply a matter of what degree of change is enough to allow the smooth transition of thought. And that's not like an objective fact in the world. That's just a matter of what our minds tend to notice.
There's nothing scientific about it. It is entirely arbitrary.
Yes.
If I used a pencil to write with all year, and I gradually sharpened it and sharpened it until I was left with a stump of just an eraser, we would say, I've been using the same pencil all year. Whereas if I don't know, broke it off and then, like, sharpened it, we might be inclined to call that a different pencil. But there's nothing scientific. There's nothing in the pencil, and there's nothing in the world, and there's no standard by which we can explain that differentiation. Maybe that language is a little more helpful to newcomers. So yes, exactly what you said, just worded slightly differently. I like to say things two different ways to make sure we capture as large of an audience as we can.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. Yeah. I mean, actually, so maybe this is putting it in a third way, but Hume himself, I think, kind of sums up similar. Well, the point that he says in this is now paragraph 14, but he says, so this is where he's saying that, there are certain objects in the world which, by their nature, tend to be just changeable a lot. So he uses the example of a river, how rivers have a tendency to just change suddenly. Like, you might have a river that suddenly becomes almost a flood, and it's very, very different, but we're used to that because that's just how rivers work, right? So it's expected. And he says, what is natural and essential to anything is in a manner expected, and what is expected makes less impression and appears of less moment than what is unusual and extraordinary. A considerable change of the former kind seems really less to the imagination than the most trivial alteration of the latter, and by breaking less the continuity of the thought has less influence in destroying the identity. So again, it's that the attribution of identity to an object over time is really just a matter of, like, how we think about that object. It's a matter of how easily our thought moves from the object at this time to the object at a later time.
Really putting a very fine point on the fact that this is a psychological experience of identity, not a scientific or philosophic one.
Yeah. And I like to emphasize that. I think Hume was a lot of Hume's views came down to psychology, let's say. And
he would observe psychology being used as scientific explanation, and then highlight that actually, no, there was nothing scientific about it. In fact, it was just a psychological phenomenon that we were observing and then trying to impose that on the natural world.
I don't know if you've because I know you said you talked about empiricism. Have you talked about, like, Hume on causation and stuff, or is that?
Causation was actually, like, what we missed due to the coronavirus.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I was going to sort of draw a connection there, but
I mean,
wouldn't.
we could talk about causation. I don't think you need to read Hume on causation to understand Hume on causation. What I did was I taught the modern debate. So my students certainly understand this idea that there are two possible ways of knowing about the world. They are incompatible with one another, and that Hume really, I mean, depending on how you feel about Hume or Kant, Hume possibly just kind of ended the conversation, especially with his work on causation. So, is that fair? Here's a mic drop.
I mean, I don't know if I'd want to put it quite that way, because there has been a lot of work on causation since Hume, right? So,
yeah.
But
oh, go ahead.
No, it was just that like Hume's account of causation sort of treats it as something as like a matter of what the mind is expecting, and it's just sort of similar to what he says here, basically. But
so I'll summarize for my students and for newcomers to philosophy. There is nothing in an object. I'm gonna break off a leaf. This leaf, right? If I drop it, it's going to fall, and we see that reliably over and over again, and we want to say that that is a fact. But there's nothing in the leaf that has falling in it that says when dropped should fall. Outside of experience, outside of just continually seeing cause and effect, leaf drop fall every time, outside of that expectation we have, there's no good reason that when I let go of this leaf, it shouldn't just like hover in the air or turn into a duck. Or I don't know, be teleported to Pluto. It's really hard to you can't really find causation by looking at the things. It is entirely a matter of observation and expectation built out of that observation. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I think that's pretty fair. I actually would. You said something about seeing cause and effect. But I would.
Yeah, no, we don't.
You see what you see is just like one event followed by another, right? You see you hold the leaf, you let go, and the leaf falls.
And I release the leaf, and So you. In fact, thank you for calling me out on that, because what Hume is going to say is that you cannot see the cause. Like, where is it? Mm-hmm. Look around. It's not there. That's a problem. That's super weird.
Yeah.
So I feel like now we can talk about causation in relation to Hume.
Yeah.
Now that we just have that little.
So, okay, well, having done that then, I would just draw attention to the fact that, with respect to causation, Hume says it's a matter of like psychological expectation. You know, we see these constant conjunctions. We see things like holding a leaf and the leaf falls, and we see it over and over again. And then our judgments that the leaf is caused to fall is a matter of expectation. And he's he's saying basically the same sort of thing here, that when we encounter some change in the world that is expected, right, we have more of a tendency to just say, okay, that's an object surviving and changing through time, rather than it being a new object. So it's a similar sort of idea.
It's just we're imposing our expectations on reality. It's like identity is an Instagram filter that we pose on reality. Is that?
Yeah, I like that.
I'm glad. It's pretty nerdy. Yeah. Okay. So moving along to 15, this is where he really gets into personal identity, which is distinct from identity of objects and numeric identity in particular. I feel like you have a lot to say about this, Kane.
Well, do I? Why do you feel like that? Okay, I mean...
because I know how you feel about Hume.
I mean, I don't know. Well, okay, all I would say at this point, so paragraph 15, Hume is applying the lessons, I guess, of paragraph 6 to 14 to personal identity. And actually, I didn't have a lot of notes on paragraph 15 specifically. But the only thing is that he says, the identity which we ascribe to the mind of man is only a fictitious one, and of a like kind with that which we ascribe to vegetables and animal bodies. It cannot therefore have a different origin, but must proceed from a like operation of the imagination upon like objects. So he's basically saying, look, all that's, the reasons why we attribute identity to objects like cups and plants and animals, that's basically the same reasons why we would see a person as having identity over time.
Yeah, because we change very slowly and seem recognizable, and we can tell a story from point A to point B, and it's psychological. I do think there's something else in here. Mm-hmm. I think Hume had to be a little cautious when talking about, things in the soulish region. Mm-hmm. And I do want to highlight, it cannot therefore have a different origin, but must proceed from a like operation of the imagination upon like objects. I think he's very subtly ruling out souls, right? Or anything like a soul. He does this a couple times, but that's what I take that sentence specifically to be.
Yeah.
Right. We have this desire to say, okay, well, there's a different origin from which human beings, we're special, we're somehow different. We could get personal identity from some other place. And he's saying that simply cannot be the case here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
As long as we're in agreement.
Okay. So, anything more there, or do you want to?
I'm good with 15. Honestly, I kind of put it on you because I didn't have a whole lot to say about 15, except for that atheistic final sentence.
Yeah. Okay. All right then. So, paragraph 16. Anything in particular you want to say about that?
He is a bit sassy, but lest this argument should not convince the reader, though, in my opinion, perfectly decisive, let him weigh the following reason, which is still closer and more immediate. 'Tis evident that the identity which we attribute to the human mind, however perfect we may imagine it to be, is not able to run the several different perceptions into one, and make them lose their characters of distinction and difference, which are essential to them. Actually, I'm going to read the whole paragraph. 'Tis still true that every distinct perception which enters into the composition of the mind is a distinct essence. Right? The emphasis there is a distinct essence and is different and distinguishable and separable from every other perception, either contemporary or successive. But as notwithstanding this distinction and separability, we suppose the whole train of perceptions to be united by identity. The page break is right there. A question naturally arises concerning this relation of identity, whether it be something that really binds our several perceptions together or only associates their ideas in the imagination. And again, this is just the reason I wanted to highlight that whole thing is it's essentially bundle theory as I understand it, and my favorite articulation of it right here, right? We have all these disparate, separate impressions and experiences, and they have to be different. They have to be distinct. And there is no apparent thing binding them together. It has to be imagination. Did you have any notes on that section? Because I feel like that's a really powerful section.
Yeah, that is. I hadn't made a lot of notes, but actually, no, you're right. That is a, like you say, powerful section. And actually, I think, is a good expression of the point you raised earlier about how Hume is also making an argument that even at any single time, there's nothing that unites perceptions and ideas together. And I mean, that's pretty much one of the things he's explicitly saying right here, that perceptions are distinct existences. So
and this is why we can not just take him to be saying that identity doesn't survive over time, but possibly even going so far as to saying identity simply does not exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Crushing it, Hume.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Is there anything like we want to say in criticism of Hume? Because I guess we've laid out his main argument here, right? Do you want
maybe
to bring...
we could end.
Sorry?
By trying, I mean, maybe rather than going through the rest line by line, unless there's anything in particular that you wanted to talk about, this might be a really good time to raise some additional criticisms, because we did have one criticism.
Yeah, well, I think there were a couple of other things that are worth drawing attention to in the paper. So
okay, because this is basically where I was prepared to stop.
Okay.
So tell me what I missed.
Well, no, I mean, it's not. I don't know how important this is, but where is this? So, okay, I think this is on sort of paragraphs 19 and 20. Hume talks about how, so the way the human mind works is it's this system of perceptions and ideas that are linked by cause and effect, right? So you have an impression, say, will then cause some other idea. I might, for instance, have I might see a cup, somebody holds up a cup, and then that causes in my mind the idea of a table, for example, because cups go on tables, right? So we can sort of see these perceptions as all being linked together by cause and effect. Now, Hume says that what makes us think of this chain of perceptions and ideas as a single identity is the fact that we have memory of things that we have done and things that we've experienced in the past. So we can remember our past, and we can see that that was similar to what we're experiencing now, and so that's what allows us to see that there's this gradual change going on. But the key point he makes, and this is on paragraph 20, is that memory kind of it sort of allows us to see that there's this chain of causality, but memory doesn't constitute personal identity. So I think we talked in the first video, before we talked about the Swinburne reading, did we talk about Locke? I think we briefly mentioned this idea. Yeah. So the idea that what constitutes our survival over time is the fact that we remember what we were doing in the past. And Hume disagrees with that. So it's at the end of paragraph 20, he says, in this view, therefore, memory does not so much produce as discover personal identity by showing us the relation of cause and effect among our different perceptions. It will be incumbent on those who affirm that memory produces entirely our personal identity to give a reason why we can thus extend our identity beyond our memory. So the thought is, well, there's loads of stuff I was doing in the past that I don't remember, right? I don't remember exactly what I was doing on January the 21st, 1999, but I still have the inclination to say that I was around on January the 21st, 1999. And Hume's point is, well, once you see that, like, there's these relations of cause and effect between perceptions, you can extend that chain of causality beyond the point that memory reaches. You can extend it to points in your life that you don't remember. And so that sort of presents a slightly different picture to what Locke was presenting.
Well, as entirely a product of imagination.
Yeah.
Which is why Hume is going to put it in that same category as illegitimate, as a source of identity, because it is purely imagined.
Yeah, but yeah. So I mean, just the key point I was, I guess, drawing attention to was that he's raising an objection here to the Lockean idea of personal identity being a matter of remembering what you've done in the past, which I think is, I think it's a fairly good point. Like at least our tendency to ascribe identity to ourselves, we don't only base that on what we remember.
Mm-hmm.
So Hume has a slightly different account there. Yeah, and I think...
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's pretty much everything.
I mean, we actually came to a huge point of criticism I have with Hume. It's not so much about personal identity, which was why I moved away from our reading at that point, because I was like, we're doing bundle theory, and bundle theory appears to be done earlier. But he had some very strange views on imagination, and his ontology is very strange because of that, right? I'm trying to remember it. I've spaced on it, but he's very criticizable there. I'm just struggling to find a way to criticize Hume because we both like him so much. I feel like we're being unfair. We really dragged Swinburne, and maybe we should try to drag Hume a little bit, but I don't really have much to criticize. I think, at least for my students, so I am a bundle theorist. I'll out myself on this one. I'm also an error theorist. I'm pretty much in line with Hume with regard to everything.
Just a second. There was a minute there where you sort of things stopped. And so I think we might have lost a bit of the sentence. So do you want to maybe just go back to the start of the point you were making? I'm not sure if we did or not.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, so it's hard for me to criticize Hume. I will out myself as a bundle theorist. I agree with Hume here. I also consider myself an error theorist. When we get to metaethics, that will come up. I'm a very uncomfortable error theorist. And I'm kind of a very uncomfortable bundle theorist because as strong as Hume's arguments are, and as even to date, like salient as I find them to be, you give up a lot when you accept bundle theory or error theory. And that can be a criticism. Philosophy isn't pure science, as much as we might like it to be. Sorry, there's a noise. Philosophy isn't pure science. We're not working with, we are trying to get to the truth of the matter, but we can rely to some degree on our intuitions to inspire criticisms, maybe not to wholly develop or constitute criticisms, but they're not irrelevant. And if we accept bundle theory, we give up entirely the idea that any personal identity exists. And this is going to mean that, so when Kane and I agreed to make this series of videos during coronavirus, to cheer everyone up, the person who agreed to make these videos with Kane no longer exists. I have no obligation to him, and he has no obligation to me, because it is entirely an illusion that I exist. If you sign a contract, you can just decide not to pay, because that was some other person entirely. As I joked about in our last video, anyone fails to do their homework and really wants to prove to me that they're getting this this personal identity thing, probably the best thing you could say is, well, I didn't exist at the time. Because that's what bundle theory is going to give you. And it can be kind of painful. I have a few students who, when I laid out the modern debate, they were 100% empiricists. One student wrote a paper where she called rationalists myopic, and she was very upset. She was like, how could anybody think this? And I want them to understand that there's a very real struggle here. If you accept empiricism, especially empiricism by way of Hume, you're going to give up personal identity. You're also going to give up any kind of objective right and wrong, which again, we'll get to later on down the line. But that is not without significant consequences. It makes a lot of logical sense, but intuitively, it it has its problems. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think there's another way to look at this, though, which is that maybe the way that we were thinking about personal identity before was confused, but you can still talk about a sense of personal identity if you accept bundle theory. Then it's still going to be the case that, okay, at time number one, right, there's a certain bundle of impressions, and at time number two there's this other bundle of impressions, and they're very similar. And I suppose a question a Humean might ask is, why do you need anything more than that, right? Actually, I think Hume sort of gestures to this himself, because at paragraph 21, he says, "The whole of this doctrine leads us to a conclusion which is of great importance in the present affair, viz. That all the nice and subtle questions concerning personal identity can never possibly be decided, and are to be regarded rather as grammatical than as philosophical difficulties." And I think the way that I read him here is as saying, well, like, okay, there's no personal identity in the sense that there's a kind of persisting, unchanging thing.
There's nothing to go in that necessary and sufficient condition statement that we created.
But then in sort of, I guess in practical terms, right? Like, obviously we attribute identity to things over time, and we do that just on the basis of like what works, what helps us get by in the world. Because obviously you can't just approach the world as consisting of constantly changing objects that have no relation to each other or anything. Like, it's very, very useful to see the world as consisting of these things that exist over time. And so then it's just a matter of, well, what helps, what's practical, what's useful, and why would you need anything more than that? So maybe, I don't know if that helps.
Oh, I don't know if you heard me. I said you're channeling William James, and unfortunately I am not doing a section on American pragmatism. But yeah, Hume leans this way in a lot of his work, where he sees these problems as cold and abstract and fun puzzles that can stress you out and you can fall into completely, but that don't necessarily have any effect on the way we ought to live our lives.
Yeah.
So I suppose my criticism is only as strong as his apology, which is to say neither are particularly rigorous. It's just whether you can accept this, accept that identity is entirely something, a fiction, a convenient fiction that we created. And whether that can be satisfying to you, or whether you want to explore it further with the rigor that would allow you to fill in the blank on that question we've been looking at. They're very emotional responses. They're not necessarily the most logical.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. There's actually another point along the same lines I was hoping to make, because I think there's an interesting connection between the Hume paper and the Swinburne paper. I mean, they seem to be offering very, very different theories of personal identity, but there's something they both do, which is similar, which is what you get with the Swinburne paper is you get a soul that will potentially survive death. And so that perhaps helps to alleviate the fear of death. And I wonder if perhaps the Hume paper might do the same thing, because what is it that we fear when we fear death? Well, we don't fear the loss of the specific bundle of impressions and ideas that are going on at this moment, because, like, I know that the impressions and ideas happening here right now, they're going to change, right? That specific bundle is not going to survive. So what I seem to be afraid of is the loss of something that unifies them. I fear the loss of myself. But of course, Hume's saying, well, you haven't got a self anyway. So what is there to be afraid of? I don't know whether, again, is that perhaps a more positive spin on what Hume is offering here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've heard it put in this really nice way that I'm so glad you reminded me of. it's a two-edged sword, right? You lose the fear of death, but also, for example, you have no reason to be excited about going on spring break in this coming week because you won't be around to experience it. It makes makes no sense to do that. And when you're on spring break and you're dreading going back to school, that doesn't make sense to do either because that person will be a totally different you. And I think the positive spin there is that it allows you to live very much in the present, which I kind of like. So, and I guess we're permanently on spring break now. So that's, yeah, doubly no reason to dread it. But yeah, it can, we can get almost very Eastern about it, or kind of a Schopenhauer-esque in that it can be a very like present only view.
Mm-hmm.
Carpe diem, or YOLO, as the kids say, might be Hume's summary of what to do with the fact that you don't exist.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else we need to say about this?
No, but I totally want to make a Hume YOLO comic shirt now. I'm really I'm glad we stumbled on that. I think that's everything. I could have sworn there was one other thing I wanted to say about Hume in this regard. Oh, yes. Okay. So, and this is more for my students, but again, happy to upload PDFs of anything. If you don't find any of the theories we've looked at satisfying, or any of the theories for Kane's YouTube folks satisfying, Derek Parfit attempts to kind of reconcile some of these problems. He takes a theory that's a lot like Locke's memory theory, and maybe a bit like Hume as well, or any body identity theory, or kind of tries to synthesize several of these theories together to say that, okay, baby me is definitely not the same me as, me who is recording this video right now. But who would want it to be? I recognize that I've changed significantly. And, I wasn't bullied during high school. I was actually bullied quite a bit. Big surprise. Super nerd. But if I encountered my bully today and they apologized to me, something they might say is, I'm not that person anymore. And we would take that as meaningful. We would all understand exactly what that means, and we would agree, you are indeed not that person anymore. So Derek Parfit's argument acknowledges that, yeah, you change and are literally different people throughout your life, but possibly the slowness of it allows us to draw a series of bundles around the different persons we are throughout our lives. And I quite like that view. It's a bit more sentimental than I would like, but it's an excellent reading. I'd suggest you guys read it if you're actually struggling with this and beginning to think that you don't exist. And I will happily provide it for Kane's audience. And if you guys want to discuss it more, maybe we can take some time to do that. Again, that's Derek Parfit. He also has a really fun thought experiment involving transporters, which is where Kane and I started this. So it seems like a fun place to end this.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Sound good?
Yeah.
Done with identity theory.
Okay. So, all right. Is that everything then? Shall I?
That's everything. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.